chairs will go grab a couple. All right, we got some extra chairs, so now you can grab a seat. Okay, well, good evening, and welcome to everybody. This is the February meeting of the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. And that's CRES. I'll use the acronym from here on. Let me introduce myself. I'm Stephen. I'm the Director of Programs. So I help coordinate a lot of the things like this speaker series. And I'll just go through the agenda for the meeting, and if all goes well, I'll only take 5 minutes of your time, and then we'll get on to our speaker. I'll briefly introduce CRES to you all, and then we'd like to talk about some current events. And we'll move right into our speaker, which is Mr. David Kline, talking about climate change and the dialogue that goes along with that. Following the presentation, we'll have some question and answer time. At about 8 o'clock, we'll wrap that up, and if you have additional questions, our speaker has agreed to stick around afterwards and answer any remaining questions you have. Then we'll wrap up our meeting with some chapter announcements and tell you about our upcoming events. So I see a lot of familiar faces tonight, but for the benefit of our new members and also those who may be watching this on video, we'll tell you what CRES is all about. The mission statement's up there, and I'm not going to read it, but the bottom line is we're a statewide, all-volunteer organization, and we are dedicated to advancing renewable energy and energy efficiency and all forms of sustainable development. We do two things principally. We advocate and we educate. You're here tonight as a means of our education side. We also get involved with policy and legislation as best we can throughout the state. We have a steering committee that helps keep our chapter engaged and active, and I will introduce each of them, and if you could quick raise your hand, that will help us to get to know each other. In the back, Mariana is our chair. Chris is not here tonight, he's our vice chair. We have a membership director. Craig in the back is our finance director. Michael does our outreach, and he's also the immediate past chair. Doug does communications. Roddy helps us with fundraising. We're always looking for more help. If you want to get involved, please see one of the smiling faces with the CRES name tag. If your parents always talk about how talented you are, come share your talents with us. Now we like to talk about current events and highlight what's going on in Colorado. I couldn't help but notice there's an important story going on related to the Olympics. And if you've been watching, you've seen how technically advanced these snowboarding competitions have become. There's actually some researchers that are seeing that the number of high aerial maneuvers and twists and turns are actually being wasted if we would just put some wind turbines up there on the athletes. So hopefully in 4 years we'll be able to power our chairlifts by some other means. That was fake news. The real news. In January, Governor Hickenlooper signed something called the Electric Vehicle Plan. And this is principally to get adoption of electric vehicles by making charging more accessible. There's several points to the plan, and it is primarily about individual users, but they're hoping to expand charging stations to places where they don't exist today, including tourist destinations. There's an ambitious goal of 1 million electric vehicles by 2030, and there's also some projections of the savings that would provide the consumers, through lower usage costs for the vehicles. So it's in its early stages, but if you want to read more about it, you can look at the Colorado government website and your favorite news outlet. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. In 2018, you don't have to look far to see that there's opposition to things like renewable energy. And you may have uncertainty when you hear news stories about things like solar tariffs and reducing budgets for research. So if there's a debate in these areas, how do we engage? How do we prepare? Now our speaker tonight is going to share his insight about opening up dialogue on both sides of the aisle. And he's done that on a polarizing subject of climate change. Dr. David Kline spent over 22 years in energy policy, most recently at NREL prior to retiring, and now he devotes his time to the Citizens Climate Lobby, reaching out to lawmakers about energy policy. Much like CRES, it's a grassroots organization, and it relies on volunteers, and I think we have a lot we can learn from their efforts. So here to speak to us tonight about talking to climate change to difficult audiences, let me introduce David Kline.
Okay, so I'm not quite as tall as Stephen. All right, give me a second here, and I'll get my presentation up. It's over here. There we go. So, Trump just said, where can I find a man who's forgotten about words so I can have a word with him? Right, so I'll just leave you with that koan to begin with. I'd like to find out a little bit about who I'm speaking to. So these are a couple questions that I asked. How many people in this room think climate change is an urgent problem? No surprise. I think I did see a few hands that didn't go up, surprisingly. Okay? Do you think fossil fuels, it's going to be difficult to get the world off fossil fuels? How many? Show of hands? Okay. So do I, but perhaps not as hard as you think. And we'll see some more about that later. So who am I and what am I doing here? I'm here on behalf of my grandchildren. So you didn't know you were going to see a slideshow about my grandchildren, but the only point of that is they're the ones really who sent me here. Stephen mentioned a little bit about my training. I trained as a technocrat, right? I came up through technical training to figure out, using mathematics and economics, what's the best way to solve a particular public policy problem. And I focused on energy. I started with oil and gas. I worked on natural gas for the state of California, and then I was recruited by NREL, and I worked on renewable energy and energy efficiency policy, first for the United States government, and then with another cooperation with a number of governments all around the world, try to figure out in the less developing country context, how do you get them on a development path that's a lower carbon development path than we did, but still benefits them and achieves all their goals. So I had a lot of fun doing that. But when it comes to talking to people about climate change, which is probably the most polarized, significant public policy issue that we have, being trained as a technocrat is a disadvantage. And you'll see more about that. So why do we talk about climate change? Some shout outs from the audience. Why do we want to talk about climate change?
Because it's happening right now?
Yeah. So, anybody?
Because there's a faction of people that deny it.
Okay.
Now or never.
Now or never. Okay. I like that. Back here in the corner.
There's no more cheaper solutions than addressing it now than later.
Yeah. Cheaper to address it now than later? Great. So, when you're first thing to think about when you want to talk to somebody about climate change, why do you want to talk to them? And in this talk, my assumption is going to be we're talking to people about climate change because what we want to do is motivate people to act on climate change and get behind solutions. So I'm going to talk about the fact that it's not about the data. It's not about the logic. It's not about the science. That's why being trained as a technocrat is a huge disadvantage. It's more about making a connection on a personal level. And to do that, you want to lead with empathy and respect. You want to become a trusted messenger. That's the only way that you're ever going to have any chance of being persuasive with somebody who's got different political views than you do, is to get their trust. You want to understand what the differences are between people. I hope I'll leave you with a little bit about what drives political differences, and respect those differences. I hope I'll be able to share with you some pitfalls that'll help you not hit people's trigger points that are going to drive them away from you. And then we'll close again with empathy and respect. So, savoring the world, okay? So, I'm going to give you an illustration, and in fact, I'm going to give you a chance to practice storytelling. Because the most important, very important skill that you can use to your benefit is to tell your story. And if you can tell your story, that will take you a long way towards making yourself human for somebody else. So, E.B. White, who you may remember as the author of famous books like Charlotte's Web, said, "Every morning I awake between a desire to save the world and an inclination to savor it. And this makes it hard to plan the day." So, but if we forget to savor the world, he goes on, what possible reason do we have for saving it? In a way, savoring must come first. So let me ask you to do this. Let me ask you to pair up in pairs and think of a place in the natural world, right? We all live in Colorado. We all have some connection to some place in the natural world that helps recharge us. And what I'd like you to do is to spend just a couple of minutes trying to put your partner in that place. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? What does it smell like? I'll give you an example. And I'm going to cheat. I'm going to use a picture, right? So I could tell you, I've been to this place. Many of you recognize it. It's in Moraine Park in Rocky Mountain National Park. There's a river running right through the middle of it. It's this gorgeous, big, broad view up into the mountains. In the winter, you see the snow. You've got the elk in there sometimes. You get the idea. So, if you'll indulge me, pair up somebody next to you. You can go into threes if you have to. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to talk to your partner, try to put them in your place, and then 2 minutes for the other person to do it. And just to make it quickly, just decide who goes first. The person with the shortest hair goes first. 2 minutes.
Yeah, I guess I have to go first. I'm with them. I haven't been recently, but
Okay, let's stop. Look ready for some kind of turn. Thanks.
Where's that Rocky out wonderfully clean. We didn't have roads. The beauty of something in the Rocky Outcrop is once you get up there, they're flat, find the right rock. So what brings you to France?
Let's wind it up and move on. We'll be across the time here, so let's see what we can do. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about what experimental psychologists have learned that helps us understand what drives people apart along political and religious lines. There's a wonderful book, the cover of which you're seeing here, by Jonathan Haidt, called The Righteous Mind. Why good people are divided by religion and politics. He has three principles, and really his study is, how do people decide what's good and bad? The first principle is that moral intuition comes first and reasoning comes second. And morality binds and blinds, so it binds us into groups and it creates a lot of blind spots for us. And his third observation is that there's more to morality than caring about people and being fair. So let me talk a little bit more about those three ideas. The first one, and if you could take one piece away from this, take this one. That's why I gave you this nice, memorable picture of the guy on the elephant. Haidt's catchphrase for this is the rider is the servant of the elephant. And what he means by that is that through his psychology experiments, what he finds is that when you're asked to make a judgment about whether something's okay or not okay, or good or bad, that judgment comes right away from the gut level, and it's there. And then you make up a story with logic to say why it was that you did that. But the intuition, the gut level piece comes first, and the logic, the story, the why it has to be that way comes in afterwards. And that's why it's not about the data. That's why, maintaining an attitude that you have to go in there and convince people based on the data may not be the best strategy if what you're trying to do is to get people to be open to the idea and to support the idea of action on climate change. Second piece is that morality binds and blinds, and what this quotation says, if you read it carefully, is that morality binds us into groups we tend to hang out with and talk to and listen to people who have similar moral frameworks as we do, and it blinds us to people's ideas. It keeps us from being open to the ideas of people who we think have different moral frameworks than we do. And we'll talk a little bit about that through some more of Haidt's work and others, that what they decided was there's some 6 basic building blocks that people use to help them decide what's good and bad. That when you look at what kind of gut level moral judgments people make, you can see that they're driven by these 6 kinds of things. And just briefly, first one is care and harm. So we want to cherish and protect others. We don't want others to be hurt. We don't want ourselves to be hurt. Fairness and cheating, fairness versus cheating, is about justice, being fair, playing by the rules. Loyalty and its opposite, betrayal, is about sticking with your group, supporting your tribe. Authority is about obeying the traditions and obeying legitimate authority. This is really about playing by the rules and enforcing the rules. Sanctity and its opposite, degradation, is about abhorrence for disgusting things, foods, actions. And liberty and its opposite, oppression, is about, disliking and resisting tyranny and having people impose their will on each other. So the reason for going through all of that and the way that it helps us understand political differences, this may be a little bit difficult to read, so let me talk you through it. On the bottom horizontal axis, we got, you can't see that. Okay. On the horizontal axis, you have very liberal on the left and very conservative on the right. And then it shows how much importance they tend to put on the 5 different building blocks that I just talked about. And if you can't read it, the very liberal folks on the left, the most important things that drive them are care and fairness. So keeping people from harm and being fair, maintaining, level playing field amongst individuals. Those are the overwhelmingly important things to people who describe themselves as liberal. And then when you get over to the far right-hand side of the spectrum, for more conservative folks, they still think care and fairness is important, but it's less important than 3 other things, which is the loyalty, the authority, and the sanctity value. So, you can use these observations to help frame your arguments in a way that's more easily heard and, perhaps more importantly, not automatically rejected by folks who may be more on the conservative side if you happen to be a liberal. And by the way, I'm already, without having asked, and I don't think I will go back and ask, I'm assuming that most of the folks that show up for a talk on renewable energy and how to talk to people about climate change that's a difficult audience, I'm going to assume that most of the folks in this room are liberals. And I bet you there's some are not, but probably most are. So how do we make connections with people? So I'll talk a little bit about what Citizens Climate Lobby calls the one rule. The one rule is, you're going to start a conversation, you should be able to think about something with the person you're about to speak to that you sincerely respect and appreciate. And if you can't do that, think twice. You may not be ready to have the conversation. I'm going to come back again and do this in a little more political context, but that's our one rule. You lead with empathy and respect. You try to make connections. I hope that through the exercise that we did, that you got a little bit of a feeling of what does it feel like to make connections with somebody. Maybe, hopefully, in a lot of cases, somebody you don't know already. Use stories. As we did before, stories are our basic building blocks. When we talk about climate change, there's a line that we need to walk. we need to speak with passion. You know, we want to talk to people about climate change because we want people to act on climate change. We want people to act on climate change because we're passionate. We feel that this is important, but don't be Chicken Little, right? Chicken Little scares people off, especially people who, you know, have conditioned themselves to resist the idea of action on climate change. If you're telling them the world is burning down and the sky is falling, they're not going to hear another word you say. And again, I'm going to talk you through some pitfalls, some ways that we can do that. So, you know, since we can see very briefly, you know, or at least get a hint that there are differences in moral frameworks between people on the left-hand side of the political spectrum and people on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. We're talking to people who are wanting to resist the idea of climate change who are mostly on the right. How can we frame our arguments so that we get the best chance of them at least being heard and understood? You know, there was I think it was Jonathan Haidt that made what was to me a lovely little parable or aphorism about being a partisan. What does it mean to be a partisan, right? Part of what it means to be a partisan is that you have knee-jerk reactions. You train yourself to have knee-jerk reactions to certain terms, right? Remember, in politics, sometimes they talk about the dog whistle of racially charged stuff. This is a kind of a nasty one, but, you know, when you're a partisan, you train yourself to automatically have knee-jerk reactions, especially knee-jerk negative reactions to certain terms of art. So you want to avoid those knee-jerk anti-reactions. You want to avoid those terms of art. Okay. And there's a lovely talk by a fellow named Rob Willer. It's a TED Talk in September of 2016. So if you just Googled that, you can find this lovely talk, which is very motivating about how to have better political conversations. It's really nice, good compliment to what I hope you take away from tonight's talk. So, what appeals to conservatives? So these are things that you can say that have attraction value to conservatives. Free market. Get rid of subsidies. Reduce risks to the economy, to business, to infrastructure, and to defense. American ingenuity and leadership. Energy freedom. Individual responsibility. Reduce regulations, national security, increase the U.S. economy and jobs, and nostalgia, interestingly enough. We'll come back to this one. And here's the pitfalls. Failure of capitalism, not a good thing to use with conservative audiences. Corporate greed, right? Not good. Evil oil companies, exaggerated or seemingly exaggerated, you know, narratives about disaster and, you know, the world burning down, the sky falling, and all the rest of that. Climate crisis. This is when partisans who are against action on climate change have trained themselves to have an extreme knee-jerk reaction against the words climate crisis. Save the planet, environmental justice, hysterics, all that stuff. Not good. So, there's some terms of art, right? So, I mentioned that there's more to moral judgments, especially on the conservative side of the spectrum, than care and fairness. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but, you know, when you think about the fact that authority and sanctity and loyalty are more important to conservatives than they are to liberals, then there's some immediate implications about things you should do and things you shouldn't do if you're speaking to a more conservative audience. So I mentioned nostalgia. There's been an observation by folks who study communication across political divides, communication between liberals and conservatives, that one way that you can hook conservatives in on environmental issues is by harking back to a more pure, less, a more pure, more sanctified, past time than there is today. Rather than saying, we're getting more polluted and we're dumping stuff in the air and the ocean and things are going to, where in a handbasket, to say, I remember when I was a kid, and if you're as old as I am, this is a while back, when there wasn't so much traffic and when, let me give you an example. I've seen this, I've only lived in Colorado for 25 years, and I've seen all of this happen. When I moved here, it did not look like this for beetle kill, right? So I can speak to somebody who may be more conservative and say, I can remember, even in my just couple of decades in Colorado, when the forests were all green instead of being half brown, right? And then we could talk about, well, this is because the winters are not cold enough to kill the beetles, so forth. So, there's an exercise we could do about this. I think I'm going to skip it in the interest of time, but, think about, imagine in your mind, something that you've seen happen in your lifetime, and even if you're half my age, you've seen some things change. Or your grandparents may have shown you pictures of, things that were less degraded than they are now. This is a good place to go with conservatives, so I'll just leave you with that for the moment. So, when you're speaking to folks about climate change, and they may come from the conservative side of the political spectrum or not, you may hear some objections to it. You may hear things like, that the climate, all those leaked emails show that the whole thing's a fraud, or something else shows that the whole thing's a fraud. One volcano puts out more carbon dioxide than people ever will put out. The science isn't settled. There hasn't been any warming in 20 years, and anyway, the Earth was warmer in the medieval warming period. In the 70s, people were talking about global cooling, and now we're talking about global warming, and now it's climate change, and, So, what's this about? It's partly, maybe it's about uncertainty, maybe it's about, it's fathomable, we can never know, much less pronounce. People are being dishonest and cheating, or there's more uncertainty. But let's think about it a little bit more deeply than that. We might be hearing at the first level, the solution is worse than the disease. The solution is worse than the problem. All of these things might be, the solution is worse than the problem. So now here's where I begin to speak on behalf of the organization that sent me here, Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a solution that we love to talk about because it's a solution that doesn't do all the things that people are afraid about, that makes them want to resist action on climate change. There's a lot of thought out there that, folks who seemingly illogically, deny that climate change is happening, or deny that humans are responsible, or deny that it's a problem in the first place, that a lot of that is driven by what's called solution aversion. We don't want you to do what we assume you're going to do if you were going to take action on it, right? So, what we want to do is we want to head off this solution aversion at the pass. And so what we do is, if you can have in mind, and this is relatively easy. For me, I worked in energy policy analysis for a long time. But, a little bit of practice, you can own and talk about a solution that works really well and has a lot of good properties. So let me quickly talk you through this. This is the solution that Citizens Climate Lobby is advocating for at the national level. It has three parts. The first part is a fee on fossil fuels. that's proportional to the ultimate greenhouse gas emissions that are gonna come from those fossil fuels. You put it on at the way upstream point, where it first enters the economy, so where it comes out of the ground or where it comes into the port. Start it small, $15 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's about 14 cents a gallon of gas, for context. Goes up 10 bucks a year, every year for several decades. Until you reach a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That's part one. Part two, if you're an economist and you've studied this sort of thing and you look at, you're gonna take a bunch of money out of the economy through a tax that's eventually gonna get pretty big, what you know is you have to get that money back in the economy as quickly as you can. And our proposal for that is to send rebates, per capita rebates, to everybody, all eligible households in the United States, so it's essentially everybody. So essentially what you're gonna do is you're gonna collect a bunch of revenue and you're gonna divide the amount of revenue that you collected by the number of eligible individuals in the United States, and you're gonna send money out to those people, either, probably by direct deposit or checks or something like that. We would like to see that happen monthly, anyway, as often as possible. And the third part is, you've imposed through this carbon fee is gonna raise the fee not only of fossil fuels, but of everything that depends on fossil fuels and everything that depends on things that depend on fossil fuels. So the beauty of that is that it puts a signal out into the economy that's exactly proportional to the carbon footprint of everything that you buy. But what you've also done is you've imposed costs on US manufacturers. And you want to make sure that you do not put those manufacturers at a disadvantage compared to some hypothetical country that might be trading with us that doesn't have a price on carbon. So what we'll do is we'll impose tariffs at the border on stuff coming in that has a lot of carbon footprint, and we'll give rebates at the border to our exporters who want to ship to some hypothetical country that doesn't have a carbon price, okay? That does two things. It keeps the competition even, and it puts an incentive on those folks, those hypothetical folks that don't have a carbon price, to put their own carbon price on, because if they did, we won't charge them at the border, and they get the money instead of us. Okay. So, the reason why we like to talk about this solution is then we can talk about what happens if you do this. Four things happen if you do this. We did a study by a firm that I know to be the folks that you go to for this kind of macroeconomic study, Regional Economic Models, Inc. And they studied this policy over a 20-year time horizon, and what they find is emissions are cut in half, the economy grows a little bit compared to a case when you don't do it, and you avoid several 100,000 premature deaths because you improve air quality more quickly than you would have in the case with no carbon fee. And then in a separate study, we find that the majority of people, you've raised prices not only on industry, but you've raised prices to individual budgets, right? Gasoline prices go up, food prices go up, lots of prices go up. You've raised costs to people, but you've given them a dividend. More than half the people in the United States will wind up with more money in their pocket once their dividend hits the bank, even though they're facing higher prices. And it's the people at the bottom of the income scale for whom that's true. So, I'm going to hustle through this a little bit. I'm going to skip ahead here. Let's talk about this. Here's another thing about language. Suppose we said, Republicans hold a majority in Congress, and we at CCL believe that they need to be a part of the legislation that gets introduced. And in fact, we want them to be the sponsors. Or we could say, alternatively, we could say Republicans hold a majority in Congress, and at CCL we believe that Republicans need to be a part of the legislation that gets introduced. In fact, we want Republicans to sponsor the legislation. Or we could say Republicans hold a majority in Congress, and CCL believes that we need to be a part of any legislation that gets introduced. In fact, Citizens Climate Lobby wants us to sponsor the legislation. So, what's the difference? three different ways of saying essentially the same thing. What's the difference?
Phrasing. The phrasing of it and how it might be perceived.
Identity. Yeah.
What's that? Here? Was that Stephen said that?
Yeah, but you're identifying them in the first one as them
Right.
and outside.
In the first one, you're saying, I'm not a Republican. In the second one, you're saying, I'm not going to tell you whether I'm a Republican or not. And in the third one, you're saying, I'm a Republican. Okay? So we did some practice in our chapters of, at least not doing the first one, so that when you come to speak to people, you don't right away tell them I'm not part of your tribe. Because when you say I'm not part of your tribe, then you're saying you shouldn't believe a word I say. Okay. Enough on that. We can think about what's the best way to say this. Jonathan Haidt found that conservatives as a group value sanctity and purity. Knowing this, I bring up creation, care, and Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 to 30, when I speak to them, and they frequently respond positively. Well, this would say, I'm not part of that group. I talk to them. So, as an exercise, we can think about how we're going to reframe this. I'm not going to stop. We're getting a little short on time. I'm not going to actually do the exercise, but we could. So, I hope I've shown you that what I'm recommending is that you mobilize your empathy and respect before you go out and talk to folks who may have a political difference from you, may be resistant to climate change. It's a marathon. Please resist the idea that you have to win every argument and convince everybody on every single point. This will just louse you up. We already have the numbers of supporters that we need, right? We just need those folks to elect representatives that will enact their will. And so we don't have to win every argument or prove every point. Understanding differences, and we could go on, we could do a 3-hour workshop with lots of exercises on how to understand these differences and to practice, right? Practice makes better, right? I was no way able to speak to groups like Rotary clubs when I first started doing this, and now I think I can. Bridging Partisan Gulfs. So Bridging Partisan Gulfs and this Rob Willer video that I referred to is an eloquent plea for this. If we can learn to bridge partisan gulfs, we can talk to each other again on issues way beyond climate change, and we really need to. So, last few minutes here, let me talk a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby. Citizens Climate Lobby, when I retired from a career working at NREL, which is a place where when you ask people why they're there, they say, we're here to save the world. Every single person will tell you that. So when I retired from doing that, and I was one of them, when I retired from doing that and looked around for what was I going to do, what I quickly found myself doing was volunteering a lot of my time with Citizens Climate Lobby. And they're also the folks from whom I learned whatever it is I know about what I just told you about how to speak to difficult audiences, and gave me an opportunity to practice that. So what about them? We're a group, we've been around for just over 10 years. It's now really 90,000 members, more than 80,000. You can never make slides like this with numbers about CCL because they're always out of date before you can even give this talk. We have, 450 or 60 or 70 chapters. The state coordinator down here is nodding to me. I don't have 2017 numbers, but if you can't read this, these are numbers of letters and opinion articles that we've gotten out there. It's several thousand. It's 10 or 15 letters a day go in by members of our organization about our issue. We meet with members of Congress several times a day on average for every working day of the year. And we give talks like this one, or more directly focused right on Citizens Climate Lobby. Let's see, couple thousand a year, that's about 6 or 7 a day, every day of the year. So we've got a lot of people out there doing stuff. And, you know, we have two objectives. The first one is to promote a national policy like the one that I described. And the second one is to empower our volunteers, who are citizen lobbyists, to get good at being citizen lobbyists, right? So, you know, whichever piece of the work, we'll see the kinds of different stuff that people do that you might want to take on. There's training, there's people that have done it 1,000 times, there's materials to help people get good at it. And we've had some success. There have been several initiatives on the Republican side since 2015. There was a resolution in the previous Congress and one in this current Congress that calls on Republicans to exert leadership on climate issues. It says, climate change is happening, humans are responsible, and Congress should do something about it. So these things have been introduced. On the one hand, they never went anywhere. But on the other hand, they're a vehicle for Republican members of Congress to come out publicly and sign up to this. And at this stage of the game, that's important. Even more importantly, one of our volunteers had a key role in helping start something called the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in the House of Representatives. And it's a group that, by design, always, at all times, will have equal members of Democrats and Republicans, and its stated purpose is to, spark bipartisan discussions to come up with appropriate actions to address climate change. So again, you have Republicans coming out in public, that they're interested in talking about solutions to climate change by joining this Congress. At the beginning, right after the 2016 election, there were 15 members of this caucus. There had been 20, and then 5 of them didn't come back to the Congress. So that was at the end of the election. And now there are 70 members of this Congress. So 35 Republicans are on record as being part of this Congress and 35 Democrats. And they had a hand in defeating an anti-climate amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill. There was an amendment that said the Department of Defense should never say the word climate change and shouldn't do anything about climate change and shouldn't, continue their work in studying climate change and understanding its impact on the military. There was an amendment that said that should happen. And the Climate Solutions Caucus mobilized, and close to 50 Republicans in the House eventually voted that amendment down. So, it's a start. Here's a picture. There's the 35 Republicans and the 35 Democrats. Again, this is something that usually when you put up a slide like this, it's usually out of date. This one's up to date. You can see a little bit more about Citizens Climate Lobby on the series Years of Living Dangerously. Bradley Whitford, who from the West Wing, is on our board, advisory board. And so there's a couple of episodes in season 2 that have to do with Citizens Climate Lobby. Episode 7 actually shows Bradley Whitford being trained by Mark Reynolds, our executive director, and some others on how to be a citizen lobbyist. So that's pretty cool. And so I mentioned our mission, the 2 parts to it, the political piece and the empowerment piece. We're out there to develop strong and respectful and long-term relationships with elected officials and their staff, to enlist allies in that effort, to educate constituents, and maybe equally important, to bring hope to people. So again, the one rule, right? We train people to go out there and lobby their representative, and we have one rule about that. You're going to go lobby a member of Congress, you have to know something sincerely, that you sincerely appreciate and respect about that person's work for the country as an elected representative. And if you don't have that in your heart, go to a different meeting. Very simple rule. And there was a great article in Energy and Environment News, and they talked about, sort of this aspect of our work, and they referred to this as our secret weapon, be nice. And there's some wonderful anecdotes about, how much the staff, especially, and the members of Congress appreciate the fact that we don't come at them with a verbal meat cleaver. So, what kinds of stuff we do? We do outreach like you're seeing me do right now. We put stuff in the paper. We get interviewed on the radio. On the upper right, we try to get folks to endorse this, especially municipal governments or people that have particularly loud voices that are likely to be listened to by elected representatives, businesses, faith leaders. And then we go down there in person and we speak to our representatives. So that's the kind of things that we do as volunteers. I've done all those things. I will show you that, I've got a number of, I've given you just a little taste here. I wish I had another couple hours to talk to you about this and let you go do some more exercises. But there's a bunch of more good stuff out here. I can make the slides available that would have all these resources on there. The Rob Miller talk is on there. I'm going to say thanks. Here's my contact information. I do have a few cards with me that I could give away. And if you want to find out more about Citizens Climate Lobby, you can ask me afterwards. I'm also going to ask my colleague, Susan Ludwig, to stand up. This is Susan. She's one of the two state coordinators of our group in Colorado. She has a couple of sign-up sheets. And if you want to know a bit more about Citizens Climate Lobby, please give us your contact information. And now, you folks live all over the metro area, and so your zip code is important, because that will mean that the right chapter will get in touch with you, right? So if you'd like a chapter to get in touch with you, please do sign up, if you'd like. And we have maybe 7-8 minutes for questions and discussion. Thank you. You're in a check shirt.
You had the slide up there about tariffs, carbon expensive and carbon not. Is there an example of a specific item that you could point out that would work in the international economy right now, with that being the slide where you had the tariffs?
So the border adjustments you're talking about?
Exactly, a good example.
Okay, let me give you an example. So an automobile, in very round numbers, a medium-sized car might have a carbon footprint of about 20 tons. 20 tons of CO2 equivalent to make a car, all right? So let's say we're in a year where the carbon fee is $50. So some hypothetical car manufacturing country is sending a car over here and they have no carbon fee, and we have a $50 carbon fee. So when that car gets to the border, we'll charge them $1,000. Because we figure it took them 20 tons to manufacture the car, times $50 a ton is $1,000. And let's say General Motors wants to send a car to that country. We will give General Motors a $1,000 rebate when it gets to the border for shipment to that particular country. Does that answer the question?
Yep.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. I hear. Front row.
One of the things that came to mind with having a dividend in addition to the carbon tax is, does that in any way sort of, I don't know, incentivize fossil fuel production in the minds of people who are receiving that dividend? The more fuels that are produced and taxed, the more money goes into your pocket, and does that create some sort of entitlement that people might then want more of, or not want to lose?
So the way that economists look at it, which is the way that I was trained, is that, when you go to buy stuff in the market, the prices of those things have been increased proportionally to their carbon footprint. But the rebate that you get, is only dependent on the, if you consume a little bit more carbon gasoline, something like that, right? You're gonna spend $10 on that gasoline and the carbon revenue is gonna go up, $10, and your share is gonna be, vanishing in a small fraction of a penny. So, it really doesn't become worth it for you to just go out there and consume fossil fuels to raise the carbon revenue to get more money, right? And the other thing that's really important from an economic point of view is, the amount it costs your budget is proportional to how much carbon footprint you purchase, right? In your fuels and all your goods that you buy. Right, your dividend doesn't depend on that. Your dividend just depends on how many people in your house.
Like I said, I'd say, why have the dividend at all if ultimately it's gonna disappear, ideally, if we completely wane off fossil fuels? You're just taking money away from someone that you would be.
That's in a long enough run that we don't have to worry about it. The dividend revenue keeps going up at least for 20, 30 years, right?
Now you go back to
Yeah,
that same thing with life.
Yeah, here in front of us.
So, do you have a case study or two where you talked to a difficult group or been in a situation where you talked about this and, had success? Or?
So the nicest compliment, so for a while I did a lot of Rotary clubs, and then a couple of other people who were more connected to Rotary Club took that over. The nicest compliment I ever got on a talk that I gave was at a Rotary Club. And one of the folks that heard that talk became involved a little bit in citizens climate lobby and said to one of my colleagues, this guy, David, came and talked to our club, and finally we got to talk about climate change without having a big fight. And so I thought, I wish I remembered exactly what I did on that day. I would have done it more. I will also tell you another Rotary anecdote, which is, when I asked at the beginning how many people think climate change is an urgent problem, in a typical Rotary club, it'll be around the middle somewhere. Sometimes a third, sometimes 2/3, usually around half. One Rotary club, I had a couple dozen people, not quite as many as in this room. I asked the question, not a single hand went up. That was probably the hardest talk I ever gave. That one didn't go quite as well. I wasn't as practiced by then, but, I did okay. Here.
I can understand having kind of like that biblical response to, like, I've heard people say, God gave us oil, why would we use anything else? And I think you could counter that and say, well, God also gave us the sun, and God also gave us, streams for hydroelectricity, and refer to the Bible. You also talked about not leading with data. I don't remember the year who said it specifically, but there was a congressperson who said that using solar energy would use all of the sun's energy and we would die because the sun would run out of energy. How do you respond to that? I mean, you can't not respond to that scientifically because it's not true. But I mean, how would you spin that? Like, I can understand spinning the Bible or spinning the conservative sanctity of nature.
One of the things that Citizens Climate Lobby teaches you is that if you don't know the answer, don't make it up. You say, I'll get back to you. So I don't have a good answer for that. But I think what I would try to do, this person's obviously got some serious issues with compared to what most of us think are the facts. I would try to take the discussion somewhere else. It's like, let's look at the advantages of some of these things. 2 minutes, is that what you told me? Two more questions? All right, so who hasn't had a chance to ask a question? Way in the back, I know I talked to you, let's see, very back corner, and then you.
Can you talk about the dividend, and you said qualified citizens or qualified members of the family? What does that mean, and what's the rules, and like how was the child?
So we don't get to write the law, right? The politicians get to write the law. But our suggestion is that, it goes according to the number of people in your household with some qualifications. So a full share for every adult, a half a share for every kid up to age 21, but a limit of, credit for 2 kids. So You know, you get up to 2 adults and 2 kids, and then you get, that's the most you can get, is 3 full shares, right? And so, you know, some thinking went into, you know, we don't wanna subsidize lots of kids, we don't wanna, you know, we wanna put some limit somewhere. So that's our proposal. And then, I know I met you, yes, you.
Yeah, so Gary Hart was an advocate of this concept of point of extraction dividend or carbon tax with a dividend. Have you learned from him? Is he involved at all?
You know,
Is
I
he
don't
promoted
remember,
this?
I don't remember this particular history about Gary Hart. I didn't live in Colorado then.
No,
but-
not while he was a senator, but long after.
After that, yeah,
like
I don't know.
5, 10 years ago.
I don't know. Susan's not remembering any connection between Citizens Climate Lobby and Gary Hart. And
Maybe
I believe
call him
that's
up.
true, I
He
just
might
don't
have some
know.
ideas.
Yeah, yeah,
Or
you
learn
know,
from his mistakes.
Yeah.
who knows? Yeah.
That's-
Okay, so I guess that's the end of the formal Q&A. As Stephen promised you, I'm happy to stick around and answer any more questions. So I'll be here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, David. That's, you know, in such a short amount of time, so much to learn. Let me just give us a couple quick announcements, and then we'll let you have time to talk more with David. You know, actually, rather than have you watch me sit for the presentation, I just wanted to share our upcoming events. So our next speaker series, you know, we do these typically the third Thursday. That's going to be March 15th. And we have a speaker from the city and county of Denver. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're going to see the
Oh, you want to go to, sorry, keep going.
Denver Housing Authority has a community solar garden that just got off the ground recently. We're going to hear about that. The other thing coming up even sooner than that, we have, you know, as we said, we're a volunteer organization, and from time to time, besides these speaker series, we're going to do a happy hour to try to get our volunteers engaged and help you become involved and network and that sort of thing. The location is close by here, so it's going to be next Wednesday at Mercury Cafe. And for those of you who haven't been there, they've been a good supporter of CRES. They're an interesting restaurant where they've got a lot of renewable power, actually Denver's first functioning windmill, among other things. So come check us out. It's right down the street, 22nd California, and we hope to see as many of you as can make it. We also, on the subject of volunteers, we always have some needs to fill. We've had some people move on from roles, and we could use your help. Here's just some ideas to get you started. I mentioned policy. We don't have a permanent policy person in the chapter, and that would go a long way to make sure that we stay on top of goings on with the local government and can call us to action to go make comments and get involved and get the word out for those kind of things. We've also used that position to be an interface with the state press. Get the word out on social media helps get people in the door. If you are skilled with that, we'd love to have your help. And to make sure that we're all well informed, we're always looking for somebody to send out the current events information that we do at these meetings. Lastly, we used to have a volunteer coordinator who's taken an increased role to manage our membership. So as we get requests from other organizations for volunteers, it helps to have a permanent volunteer coordinator. If that's your skill set, we'd love to have you. And that's all the time I'll take for you tonight, so please stick around if you'd like to talk further with David. Thanks again for those of you who became members tonight, and we hope to see you again next week or next month.
Yeah.
Yeah.